The iron stove in the forest. On the Anima Imprisoned. A king's son who lived only in his head wandered one autumn into a forest. He was 28. He had been raised at the court of a small kingdom. He had been the kind of child who, at 7, had been asking the kind of questions that at 17, the kingdom's philosophers had not been able to answer. His father, the king, had been proud of him in a worried way. His mother, the queen, had been worried in a less proud way. He had been groomed by tutors of unusual quality to be in time a king philosopher, a ruler who would govern by the careful application of reasoned principles. He had become, by 28, a man who could not, for any sustained period, leave his own head. His thinking had been, throughout his youth, his most prized faculty. It had been encouraged. It had been polished. By 28, it had become a kind of small, bright apparatus that ran continuously inside his skull, generating considerations, refining distinctions, producing arguments for and against every position he encountered. He could not, by 28, eat a meal without considering the ethics of the meat. He could not look at a woman without analyzing the social structures that had produced his attraction. He could not, in some weeks, sleep, because his thinking would not, in the evening, stop. He had gone into the forest that autumn to think. He thought well in forests. This had been since his childhood his observation. The court was too distracting. The library was too quiet in a way that amplified his thinking until it became unbearable. The forest somehow contained his thinking. The trees absorbed it. He could walk for hours and not, at the end, be sicker of his own thoughts than he had been at the start. He had been thinking, that autumn, about a problem of philosophy. It was a problem he had been working on for 2 years. He had written in his small study perhaps 300 pages on it. He had not, in the 300 pages, resolved it. He thought about it for 3 days. He walked east, then north, then in a direction he had not, in his concentration, kept track of. He had brought a small bag of bread and cheese. He had brought a flask of water. He had not brought a map. He had thought in his arrogance that he knew the forest well enough. On the 3rd day he became lost. He noticed the lostness in the late afternoon. He had been walking, he thought, north on the strength of the angle of the sun. He had been walking. He discovered on closer examination, in some direction that was not north, the sun, when he attended to it carefully, was not where it should have been for north walking. He could not, on inspection, determine which direction he had in fact been walking. He had been so absorbed in the problem of philosophy that he had not, in any of the 3 days, been navigating. He stopped on the path. He stood for some minutes, looking at the trees. The trees were not, in any obvious way, distinguishable from the trees he had passed an hour ago, or 3 hours ago, or the previous day. He had come into an unfamiliar section of the forest. He had no idea where he was. He decided to continue walking in his current direction. The direction was, in fact, not north. Then continuing it would at least eventually bring him to some edge of the forest, an edge he could follow by walking along it to a village he would recognize. He came an hour later to a clearing. The clearing was small. It was perhaps 30 feet across. It was perfectly circular. The grass in it was short and green despite the autumn. There were no fallen leaves in it. There was in the center of the clearing a black iron stove. He stopped at the edge. The iron stove was old. The iron was a deep dark black, weathered but not on inspection rusted. The stove was perhaps 4 feet high, with a single small door, with a chimney rising from its top that extended some 12 feet into the air and ended, abruptly, at the upper edge of the clearing, with no smoke rising from it. A fire had once burned in the stove. There was, around the base, the slight discoloration of long use, but the fire had been out for what looked like a very long time. The stove was cold. He approached it. He walked around it slowly. He examined its construction. He could not, on close inspection, identify a maker. There were no marks on the iron. There were no rivets that would have suggested a particular forging tradition. The stove was, in its workmanship, anonymous. He put his hand on it. The iron was indeed cold. A voice came from inside it. "Let me out," said the voice. He took a step back. The voice had been clear. It had come, unmistakably, from inside the stove. It had been the voice of a woman. The woman had sounded. He could not, in his first impression, decide whether old or young or some quality that was not in his vocabulary available for women's voices. "What are you?" he said. He spoke carefully. He had been raised by his tutors of unusual quality in the habit of careful questioning. "I am the part of you that you locked in iron because you were taught I was dangerous," said the voice. He paused. He was not, in his thinking, prepared for this kind of answer. He had been prepared vaguely to encounter in the forest some woodcutter's wife who had become trapped in the stove by some accident, who could be rescued by the appropriate procedure. He had not been prepared to encounter, in an iron stove in a clearing, a part of himself. "I have been in this stove for as long as you have been alive," said the voice. He sat down on the grass at the edge of the clearing. "I do not know how much longer I can speak," said the voice. "The iron is thick. I have grown weaker in here every year. I have, in the past 5 years, been able to speak only on the occasion when a person who carries me has come within a few feet of the stove. This is the first such occasion in those 5 years. You are the one who carries me. You are, by my reckoning, 28. I am 28 also. We were locked in here by the same act in your first year. Find a knife, come back." He went home. He found his way out of the forest by a route the trees somehow made available to him. He had been lost in the morning in a forest that seemed to have, in the afternoon, fewer ambiguities. The path he chose came out by evening at a fork he recognized. He walked home. He came back in the morning with a small knife. He had selected the knife from the kitchen. It was a kitchen knife of good quality, sharp, with a strong blade. He had not told his parents where he was going. He had told them, vaguely, that he was returning to the forest to continue his thinking. They had nodded. They were used to his disappearances. He worked at the iron for a day. He set the knife against the joint between the door and the body of the stove. He pressed. He scraped. He attempted to insert the blade into the small gap. The iron was thick. The blade was strong, but the iron was stronger. He scratched the surface. He did not, in a day of working, make any meaningful progress. He came back the next morning with a heavier knife. This was a hunting knife. It had been his father's in an earlier time when his father had still hunted. It was sharp and long. He worked at the joint again. He attempted with greater force to pry the door open. He bent slightly the tip of the blade. He did not, in another day of working, make any meaningful progress. He sat by the stove that evening with the bent knife in his hand and considered. He had been raised to think his way through problems. He had been doing this, in the case of the stove, for 2 days. He had not in 2 days made any progress. He understood, sitting there, that thinking his way through was not, in this case, the technique. He had been a man of thinking for 28 years. He had not, in those 28 years, encountered a problem that thinking could not solve. He had encountered one now. On the 3rd morning he came back without a knife. He had left both knives at home. He had walked, in fact, without any tools at all. He had come simply to sit. He sat down on the ground in front of the stove. He spoke. "I cannot break the iron," he said. "I have tried. I am sorry. I do not know what to do." The stove was silent for a long time. He sat on. He did not, in the silence, think. He had been for 2 days thinking very hard. He had now, for the first time, stopped. He sat. He listened to the small sounds of the forest, the wind in the upper branches, the occasional bird, the small dry sound of a leaf falling somewhere behind him. He did not think. He sat for perhaps an hour. Then the door of the stove opened by itself from the inside. It opened slowly. The iron on the inside made a small dry sound, the sound of a door that had not, in 28 years, been opened. There was a wave of warm air from inside the stove, despite the stove's coldness on the outside. The warm air smelled of something he could not, on first encounter, name, of earth, of certain dark roots, of the body of a woman in sleep. A blind woman stepped out. She was tall. She was young, perhaps 30, with skin of a particular pale color, with dark hair, with eyes that were closed. She was wearing a simple dress of dark fabric. She held in her hands a small black serpent. The serpent was alive. It was small, perhaps a foot long, slim, with scales that in the morning light were a luminous black. It was wrapped around her hands and wrists. It was not, on its appearance, threatening. It had the bearing of a small animal who had been a companion for some time. She stood in the clearing. "You did not need to break the iron," she said. Her voice was the voice from inside the stove. Outside in the air, it was a richer voice, warmer, with a small warmth in the lower registers that the iron had filtered out. She spoke without facing him. Her eyes were closed. She had the quality of a person who was navigating by some sense other than sight. You needed to sit down in front of it without a knife and admit you could not. The iron was waiting for you to admit it. That is the only key. Most people in your position never put down the knife. They go away. They come back with bigger knives. They come back in some cases with crowbars and chisels and saws. They never break the iron. The iron is not in its substance defeatable by any tool. The iron is defeated only by the admission. The admission, when made, is the key. The door opens from the inside. He sat on the ground. She walked slowly with her blindness toward him. She stopped a few feet away. The small serpent moved gently in her hands. "Marry me," she said, "or I will go back in the stove, and the forest will grow up around it, and you will live the rest of your life in a kingdom of paper, and you will never know why your kingdom is so thin." He looked at her. He could not, by his thinking, immediately respond. The thinking in his head had been quiet for an hour. It had not, on her appearance, restarted. It was, somehow, still quiet. He was reduced, for the first time in his life, to the simple condition of being present. He stood up, he walked the small distance to her. He took her free hand, the one not occupied by the serpent. Her hand was warm. Her hand was, on the inside, slightly damp, in the way the hand of someone who has been in a warm place for a long time is damp. "I will marry you," he said. The forest, that very evening, did grow up around the iron stove. He saw it happen. He stood with her at the edge of the clearing. The trees, which had been at the edge, moved inward. They did not, on inspection, move in any visible way. They did not individually walk. But the clearing was, after an hour of standing, smaller. After 2 hours, smaller still. By evening, the iron stove was no longer visible. It had been swallowed by the forest. The trees had grown over and around it. The chimney, which had stood 12 feet high, was no longer visible above the canopy. The stove was never found again. He walked out of the forest with her beside him. She could not, of course, see her way. He led her by the hand. She moved with a kind of grace that suggested she had, in her years in the stove, been preparing for the moment when she would, at last, be led somewhere. The serpent stayed wrapped around her other arm. They came to the edge of the forest by evening. He brought her to his father's court. He introduced her simply as the woman he had met in the forest, whom he intended to marry. His father, the king, looked at her closely. His father had been, in his youth, a man of more travel and more sense than his son had inherited. His father recognized in the woman what she was. His father nodded. "You have been gone 3 days," said his father. "You have come back married. The court will think you have been bewitched. Let them think what they will. I will perform the ceremony myself this evening." The ceremony was performed. She did not, in the ceremony, open her eyes. She did not, in their marriage of 40 years, open them. He learned over time that her blindness was not, in any conventional sense, an inability to see. She saw differently. She saw with her closed eyes things that he, with his open eyes, did not see. She did not see with her closed eyes the ordinary things he saw with his open eyes, the color of a coat, the position of an object on a table. They balanced each other. They divided the seeing of their household between them. His kingdom thickened. This was the visible effect of the marriage. He had inherited the throne in due course at his father's death. He had governed. His governance before the marriage had been thin, careful, intelligent, well-reasoned, ineffective. After the marriage, his governance became thicker. He saw, with his wife's help, things he had not seen before. He made decisions that before he could not have made. He had been, before the marriage, a king who lived in his head. He became, after the marriage, a king who lived in his head and in the dark warmth that his wife had brought with her from the stove. The thinking continued. The thinking was, in fact, sharper than it had been before in some respects. But the thinking was no longer alone. It was paired with the seeing of the woman beside him. He did not have to think well any more. This was perhaps the greatest gift. He had been, for 28 years, the man who had to think well, who had been told from boyhood that his thinking was his most valued contribution, who had been unable, at any meal or any gathering, to put the thinking down. After the marriage, he could put it down. His wife thought in her own way for him in the moments he could not think. He thought in his own way for her in the moments she could not see. They were in their joining, complete in a way that neither, alone, had been. He had married the thing that had been doing his thinking for him from the other side. This was, in the end, the strangest discovery. The thinking he had done in his head for 28 years had not been only his thinking. It had been thinking that had been generated in part by the woman in the iron stove. She had been thinking from inside the stove. Her thinking had been, by some process he did not understand, leaking out through the small gaps in the iron and arriving in his head. He had been receiving, all his life, transmissions from his locked-in part, mistakenly identifying them as his own. After the marriage, the transmissions stopped. They were no longer necessary. She was now in the open air doing her thinking beside him. He lived to be 68. He died in his bed with his wife beside him. The serpent, which had grown over the years to be a long black serpent, slept at the foot of the bed. His wife on his death did not in any sense die with him. She continued. She became, in her old age, the steward of the kingdom on behalf of their son. She lived, after her husband, another 20 years. She died at 90, with her eyes still closed, with the serpent still at her bedside. The forest, where the stove had been, is in some province still dense. The clearing has never reopened. The next king's son, in due course, will in his own time wander into the forest. He will find his own stove. The stove will be different from his father's. The voice inside it will be a different voice. The work of sitting down in front of it without a knife will be the same. The anima is in a black iron stove in the forest. You cannot break the iron with a knife. You sit down, you admit you cannot. The stove opens from the inside. The blind woman steps out. You marry her. Or your kingdom is paper for the rest of your life. Most do not. Most come back with bigger knives. They never break the iron. The admission, when made, is the key. The thinking you have been doing in your head has been, in some part, hers from the inside of the stove. After the marriage, it becomes shared. You need no longer think well alone.